Good afternoon, and welcome back to our fifth lecture on how we got the Bible. If you're jumping into this, I really highly encourage you to go back and watch some of the other ones we build in this series, and so there is some importance of knowing what's been said before, discussed before, to be able to track with what's going on. But nonetheless, even if you have not watched any of the others, you should still be able to get some good information from this lecture. This lecture is going to be focusing on the Hebrew Old Testament, the manuscripts we still have in existence today that help us piece together the original reading/writing of the Hebrew Old Testament so that then we can translate it into English or any other language. And this story is going to be very different than the Greek document story. In the Greek documents, we have thousands of things in Greek and thousands more of the New Testament in other languages. With the Hebrew Bible, that's not so much the case. And maybe that is to be expected. The Hebrew Bible is older. It ended around 400 BC, and that's 400 years before any of the New Testament documents were written. However, there are some other reasons for that, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But let's first talk about a group of scholars that really have a huge impact on the history of the Hebrew Old Testament and its preservation in history. So the Masoretes were a group of scribes that worked from 500 to 1000 AD. Primarily, if not exclusively, Jews were part of this. And before 1890, our only copies, our only form of the Old Testament Hebrew were the about 731 Masoretic texts that had been published. In other words, in the Greek story, with the Greek documents, you have about three families of text. You have the Byzantine type, you have the Alexandrian type, you have the Western type. You can go back and look at the lecture on Greek documents if those are new terms, new ideas to you. You don't have that with the Hebrew. You pretty much just have the Masoretic text. Now, that might partially be because the Masoretes tended to bury or ceremonially burn documents they saw with errors in them. And so it's possible that as they were seeking to reconstruct the texts that they decided were not representative of the original, they would then burn or bury. And that might be one of the reasons why you see so little variation, so little difference in all of our Masoretic texts that we have today. But let's talk about their attitude. It wasn't that these people were just arbitrarily choosing this teaching and that teaching and throwing out that teaching and throwing out this teaching. They had very strict rules in copying Scripture. They saw Scripture as God's very word, to the point that there were times when they would copy a word even though they thought it was misspelled, but because it was in the text and they did not feel they had the right to change the text, they would copy the word and may put a note beside it suggesting that they thought it was a misspelling of the word, but they didn't want to change the text. That's the kind of reverence these individuals had for the Old Testament Scripture. And to ensure accurate copies, they had several strict rules. One of them was they would number the verses, not the same verse system we use today in modern Bibles, but they numbered the verses, the words, the letters of every book. And they counted the times each letter was used in a book. And they noted the verses that used all the letters of the alphabet. They calculated the central letter, word, verse of the Pentateuch. They found the middle verse of Psalms and the middle verse of the entire Hebrew Bible. And then, when they made a copy, they would check each of these tallies. They would make sure that the number of letters and number of words and the placement and the verses that were supposed to have all the letters of the Hebrew Bible, they would check all of these different tallies, these different figures, to make sure they fit. And if they didn't fit, they would ceremonially burn or bury the copies they found with errors. That's how meticulous. Could you imagine copying a whole book, and then if you found one letter that was wrong, throwing it out? That's what these guys did. That's how serious they took the copying of the Old Testament Scriptures. And it's why when you come to the variants, there are so few statistically, because they were so rigorous and meticulous in making sure that their Old Testament books were copied accurately. So let's talk about some of the important Masoretic texts. Again, the scrolls that were written by this family of scribes. So one of the most important ones is called the Aleppo Codex. It is presently housed in Jerusalem, and originally it was the oldest complete copy of the Old Testament in Hebrew. Probably copied around 950 AD, again part of this Masoretic family. But in 1947, Arab riots destroyed large sections of this book. There was a fire, and the synagogue it was being housed in, and a large portion of it was lost. Very sad for history, very sad for biblical scholars, but we still have some parts of it. The oldest complete copy is what we call the Leningrad Codex. It is housed at the National Library in St. Petersburg, so that's in Russia. And as I noted, it is the oldest complete Hebrew Old Testament, probably copied around 1010 AD, maybe 1050 AD. So talking 50 to 100 years younger than the Aleppo Codex, and it pretty much stands as the model codex for most modern Hebrew texts. So if you pick up a Hebrew Bible today and you start reading, the starting point for that book was probably the Leningrad Codex. And again, one of the reasons you can do that is there is very, very little variation between the Masoretic text. Again, they were very strict in their copying, and so their text and their copies are very, very, very similar. You're typically, when you talk about variation, you're talking about a missed letter, you're talking about a missed word, nothing that changes meaning or understanding of text in the slightest when it comes to the Masoretic text. Some of the other important Masoretes, the Aleppo Codex and Leningrad Codex, are two of the most important because they were complete codexes, especially the Leningrad being used as the model for most modern copies. But we have a couple other important ones, one being the Cairo Codex, sometimes called the Codex Corensis. Again, as its name suggests, it was discovered around the Cairo region. It contains the former and latter prophets. If you go back and watch the first lecture, we define what that means from the Hebrew perspective. Probably copied by a guy named Ben Asher around 895, so a little bit older than the Aleppo and Leningrad Codex, but not by much. And initially owned by the Jewish sect called the Karaite. You also have another text that contains the prophets called the Leningrad of the prophets. It contains Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the minor prophets. Again, if you want to know what the minor prophets is, if you go back and look at the first lecture, we talk about that terminology. And it was probably copied around 916 AD. I couldn't find a public domain picture of this, and hence that's why I don't have a picture on here. But if you go look on the internet, you should hopefully be able to find a picture if you are interested. The last major Masoretic text we're going to talk about is what we call the British Library Codex of the Pentateuch, or sometimes the London Codex. As you might guess, it is housed in the British Library. It contains most of the Pentateuch. The date is uncertain. It's from around 900 to 1000 AD, but it is one of the major texts when it comes to the Hebrew Old Testament. Now, one of the things you might have noticed as we're going through those, the dates we were giving, 950, 1010, 895, when the Hebrew Bible is finished at around 400 BC. That's a very different story than the Greek New Testament. Greek New Testament, we have copies within 50, 100 years of the ending of the New Testament, particularly with the John Rylands fragment from around 125 and the Gospel of John that it represents, the Gospel of John being written 85, 90 AD. And we noted in that lecture that there may be a piece of Mark that might even be earlier. But these documents, and you get into the mid-100s, you get into the 200s, you start having quite a few documents representing the New Testament. That's a very different story here. Now again, part of that reason is old, decaying texts that are falling apart, the Masoretes would bury or burn. They would see it as a sacrilegious, they would see it as a dishonor to just let a book crumple and disintegrate into oblivion. And so they would treat it as if they would a human body, because these are the precious words of God. And unfortunately what that means for us in the present day is we don't have very many of the Masoretic texts before around 900 AD. And that's a big gap between the original writings, especially when you consider the Pentateuch. You consider Moses writing around 1500, and we have our documents of his writings coming from 2,000 years after he wrote. That is a pretty drastic realization and makes someone question, Can we be sure that it is an accurate copy? Well, that situation began to change, like I said, in the 1890s. They first found what we call the Cairo-Geniza fragments. There should be an S on that, sorry. The Cairo-Geniza fragments, which is about 300,000 Jewish writings, again, primarily in fragments. They were written on papyrus, if I remember correctly. And about 10,000 of those were Old Testament scriptures, though. Probably written from 500 to 800 AD. Okay, so that pushes us a little bit further back. But there is only limited value in trying to reconstruct the Old Testament because most of them are fragmentary, hence the name Cairo-Geniza fragments. When this really changes is when we find what is known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. You've probably heard something about the Dead Sea Scrolls. You may have questions about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I could spend a long time talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls in all, summarized the finds, we found 800 different manuscripts. About 200 of those are Old Testament scripture. And nearly every book of the Old Testament is represented in one of the finds of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Esther is an exception, and if I remember correctly, Song of Solomon is an exception. That they don't have copies or pieces of those books, but they do have commentaries on them, suggesting that the writers and the scribes who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls did indeed see them as inspired. You've got 200 sectarian, or these are documents about how to live as part of the Qumran community. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in Qumran. If you look at the map, you can see the K-U-M-R-A with that accent on top in. Sometimes it's spelled with a Q today. So it's near the Dead Sea, and around there is where these scrolls have been found. They were a group. Most scholars believe they were the Essenes. The Essenes aren't talked a whole lot about in history, but they had withdrawn themselves from Jerusalem. They saw Jerusalem and the mainstream Judaism as not truly following God, and so they withdrew themselves so that they could be the voice, the one crying out in the wilderness. They saw themselves basically as the Isaiah 40 prophecy, waiting for the day of the Lord. And their understanding of Scripture is very interesting, and we don't have time to get into all of that because our focus is on the history of the Bible. But these finds were very, very significant, and so there's about 200 that are about their life and about who they are and their thoughts. You have about 400 that we call apocryphal or pseudepigrapha. The time frame between when Malachi was written, about 400 BC, and when Jesus shows up around 0 BC/0 AD, there is a time when a lot of people are writing in very graphic novel, basically, that these pictures and these visions that are intended to make points or tell stories. And so sometimes they present themselves as inspired writing, sometimes they don't. They're just telling a story for fun or to teach a lesson. But about 400 of those are apocryphal writings. And so let's give a brief history of this discovery. The first cave, interestingly enough, the same year that the Aleppo Codex is destroyed, the first cave is found. It's found by a boy who is looking for a lost sheep, and he thinks that maybe the sheep has scurried up this hill into a cave. You can see an opening in the stone cliff face. He throws a rock into there, thinking that maybe the lamb is in there to try to scare it out, and he hears breaking pottery. So he climbs up and then he finds this cave that has several clay pots with scrolls in them. So he takes them. He doesn't really understand their significance, but he thinks maybe he can sell them to an antiquities dealer. And there's a series of events from how these scrolls pass from this antiquities dealer to this person and this scholar before people suddenly start realizing these are very important documents. Part of that original find is what we call the Great Isaiah Scroll, which we'll talk about in just a second. But when word gets out that this has been discovered, archaeological research begins, and they eventually find 11 caves, one being pictured here, cave number 4. You can see that in the cliff face there, where they had preserved these documents. Now, primarily, they were preserved in clay jars and then sealed with beeswax, which is what kept the air out and kept these parchments from decaying into nothing. Some of the jars broke over time, and so some of the caves, they found mostly just fragments, but they have found very well-preserved scrolls from around the 100s 300s era when they were written. Because what happens is Qumran realizes when Jerusalem rebels against Rome in the late 60s AD, around 68 AD, Rome sends an army to destroy Jerusalem. The Qumran community realize they're going to be caught in this struggle, and so they start taking their documents and hiding them in caves to preserve them. That's why we have found them today. So let's start talking about some of those manuscripts that have been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The first one I want to talk about is called the Great Isaiah Scroll, which we picture here at the bottom. One of the reasons this was such an important find is because it was a single, complete scroll of Isaiah. And that's for several reasons, but one of the reasons is there was a popular theory, and it's still popular in some circles, that Isaiah was really split into two books. There was an Isaiah 1 and Isaiah 2. That Isaiah 1 covered chapters 1 through 39, and Isaiah 2 covered chapters 40 through the end, chapter 66. One of the reasons that some people supported this, really kind of held to this theory strongly, is because in Isaiah's 44 and 45, those chapters, there is a very specific prophecy about Cyrus conquering Babylon. Cyrus the Persian, who does indeed conquer Babylon, and brings in the empire of the Medes and Persians as the world power, was prophesied by Isaiah. Now, if that really was written by the Isaiah during the reign of Hezekiah, around 700 BC, that is basically 200 years before those events happened. The only way Isaiah could know that is if Isaiah really is inspired of a divine being who has knowledge of the future. And for that reason, if you don't believe the Bible is inspired, you pretty much have to believe that, yes, the second half of Isaiah has to be written afterwards. But these people who loved Scripture, and just like the Masoretes, the Qumran community had a very high regard of Scripture. They were very particular about what they saw as Scripture and treated as Scripture. And so for this to be a single work and a single book says they saw it as one book. They saw it as one piece, the work of Isaiah the prophet, around the days of Hezekiah, 700 BC. But it's also significant in our quest for recovering the Bible because the constant challenge of skeptics and critics is, can a document be copied over long periods of time accurately? The constant challenge, the constant struggle is humans can't do that. They can't copy things accurately, even if they wanted to. Well, because this is a full scroll of Isaiah, we have all of Isaiah to compare. And this copies from around 100 BC, maybe even earlier. There is debate, but at least from 100 BC, which that's 1,000 years older than our Masoretic text. Remember, we have texts from around the 900s at the earliest. 900 AD, that is. So it's 1,000 years earlier than those texts. And when we compare Isaiah here, the Great Isaiah Scroll, to Isaiah in those texts, what do we find? Is it drastically different? Has it been changed and manipulated and adjusted dramatically? And what we find is that the texts are 95% identical. You're not just talking about they say basically the same thing. No, the wording, the structure, the grammar, 95% identical. And of the 5% that's different, that is primarily grammar differences, and you'd expect a language to change a little bit over 1,000 years. Spelling differences, also you expect that to change a little bit over 1,000 years. It is amazing the similarity between the Great Isaiah Scroll and the Masoretic text, reaffirming that yes, not only can, but in this case, apparently the biblical texts, especially the Old Testament, have been copied accurately throughout the centuries. However, let's look at an example from this document, the Great Isaiah Scroll in particular. So let's look at the chapter 6 of the Great Isaiah Scroll, where we see 37 different variants, and almost all of them are spelling changes. Again, if you read even writings from the early 1900s, but especially from the 16 or 1700s in English, you're going to realize the wording and the spelling has been changed since then. So this shouldn't be a huge surprise that the spelling would be different from a document in Hebrew from the 100s BC compared to the 900s. And for that reason, those really can't be represented in English. You're not going to misspell a word or change the spelling of a word because the old document spelled it differently. However, there are only about 3 changes that you're able to see. One is the question, is it they were calling or one called to another in verse 3? What is it, holy, holy, or holy, 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 also in verse 3? And is it sins plural or sins singular, verse 7? And you realize even in those changes, they don't dramatically change the statement. In fact, it's really just a question of was something added or taken away by accident. Nothing really is different in those, and that shows you the kind of differences you're going to see in the Great Isaiah Scroll versus the Masoretic text, re-emphasizing that when you read the Old Testament, you are reading, if not the original wording, I realize we're reading in English, so we're not reading the original wording, but you are reading the message that was communicated and written down by the Old Testament prophets. A couple other important Dead Sea Scroll documents before we wrap up is the Isaiah Scroll, the second one, that 1Q ISB. It's chapters 49 through 59. Again, significant for a variety of reasons, but in that section from the Great Isaiah Scroll and this scroll, you have Isaiah 53. And in Isaiah 53, we have to call the Suffering Servant Psalm. If you have not read it, I just encourage you to go read it and ask yourself, who is this talking to? And again, these two documents were written around 100 BC. You also have 4Q, called Paleo-Exodus M. So again, 4, representing that cave. We pictured that a couple slides ago. And paleo referring to the kind of script it's written in. It's from the early 2nd century BC. So you're talking about 100s, meaning 190, 180 BC. It's a copy of Exodus. It's in Paleo Hebrew. That was the font type, for a lack of a better term, the script type used before Babylon takes Israel into captivity, before they conquer Jerusalem and carry everyone off. This is the kind of writing they would use, meaning that this, if it itself is not from before that time period, but it is a copy of a document before that time period. And one thing that's interesting, we'll talk more about this next lecture, as it shows agreement with the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Septuagint at times over the Masoretic text. I hope this gives you an introduction, an idea to what is going on with the Old Testament Scripture and how it all fits together, and giving you confidence that what you're reading when you read the Old Testament is indeed an accurate representation of what was originally written. Thank you for your time.